We get bombarded with images like these. Climate change is altering the planet, and governments do little to stop it. On the contrary,
the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
Former oil industry executives in Donald Trump's cabinet talked down climate change.
There is no model that has yet been developed that scientists would say is competent at predicting the future.
But prosecutors like New York's Attorney General think that oil companies have known about climate change for decades without telling the public. Billions of dollars are at stake.
Every fossil fuel company has a responsibility to be honest with its investors and with the public. The First Amendment, ladies and gentlemen, does not give you the right to commit fraud.
The lawyer Carroll Muffett is investigating this fraud. He says he's found documents proving that oil companies have been secretly funding research into climate change for 60 years.
So the oil industry knew from the 1940s and 50s that there was a connection between sea level rise and carbon in the atmosphere. This is one of the biggest scandals in global history.
If the oil companies knew about the threat of climate change, why didn't they tell anybody? We're in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. We're trying to get hold of the oil industry's classified files. We're on our way to meet the man who found and published them. He says managers of the oil company Exxon knew about climate change for 60 years. But is this really possible? And why would they hide this knowledge?
Hello.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Carroll Muffett is working for an NGO fighting for more environmental protection. He shows us old studies on climate change. The Brannan Report examined the effects of exhaust fumes on our atmosphere back in 1957. It was commissioned by ExxonMobil. He also brought along the Robinson Report from 1968. It was written by the Stanford Research Institute and funded by the oil industry.
We have it there in black and white. Here are a few things that they said about carbon dioxide. If CO2 levels continue to rise at present rates, it is likely that noticeable increases in temperature could occur. However, there seems to be no doubt that the potential damage to our environment could be severe. Although there are other possible sources for the additional CO2 now being observed in the atmosphere, none seems to fit the presently observed situation, as well as the fossil fuel emanation theory. This device was delivered to the oil industry at its very top levels, and we can prove that. We can prove that high-level executives in all of the companies saw this report.
The Robinson Report proves that 50 years ago, the oil industry knew that burning fossil fuels had an effect on global climate.
What did they do when they knew about climate change?
The answer is that they immediately asked Stanford Research Institute to go back and check its work. They didn't like these conclusions, so they said, try again. They tried to deny, and in reporting to the government, they began cherry picking and highlighting only the passages out of this report that talked about the uncertainties, not about the realities. This is a story we'll see over and over again with the oil industry, so that the doubt becomes the message. It's a very effective form of propaganda.
Muffett can prove his claims because he has compared the original and the rewritten versions of the Robinson Report. He also thinks that the findings didn't hit the headlines because the language wasn't clear enough.
One of the reasons so much of this story was hiding in plain sight for so long is that we talk about climate change as climate change. In the 1990s, everyone talked about it as global warming. Before the 1990s, people talked about it as climate change. Before that, it was climatic change. Before that, it was the dilution of radiocarbons in the atmosphere, or the Seuss effect. And the name has changed over and over again. By the time I had learned the language well enough to understand, I had actually found this Brannan paper, the 1957 paper, maybe a year earlier. But it was only after I learned the new language that I could really understand what they were talking about and prove that what they were talking about was climate change.
But when did the oil barons start their cover-up? Muffett believes this goes back to the 1940s, when oil companies commissioned the first studies into how increasing car traffic affects the environment.
I'm thinking this is how it started, and this is why it started. In Los Angeles in the 1940s, as cars were exploding, the automobile economy was exploding, Los Angeles was plagued by smog. And when the people of Los Angeles started looking to oil and gas as the reason for smog, the industry started fighting back. And it was that fighting back that led in December 1946 to the creation of the Smoke and Fumes Committee and to the oil industry's grand strategy to combine science with public relations to constantly delay action on a range of air pollution measures that began with smog but soon expanded to include sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide, the main driver of climate change.
The committee's main goal: to prevent possible legal restrictions. As its president, Vance Jenkins, put it clearly in 1954. The worst thing that can happen, in many instances, is the hasty passage of a law or laws for the control of a given air pollution situation. Oil companies designed and funded a research network, including the Stanford Research Institute. Unfavorable reports were rewritten. Even 40 years later, ExxonMobil executives denied the very existence of these studies.
Proponents of the global warming theory say that higher levels of greenhouse gases are causing world temperatures to rise and that burning fossil fuels is the reason. But scientific evidence remains inconclusive as to whether human activities affect the global climate.
The oil industry used their knowledge to sow doubt and prevent legislation against the use of fossil fuels. But was this their only reason for doing secret climate research? We're driving to Pennsylvania to meet a former ExxonMobil employee. For centuries, ships have been built on the banks of the Delaware River. One of them was a special order for ExxonMobil. In 1969, the company turned a 300-meter-long tanker into an icebreaker for a very special trip into the Arctic.
Much of what Exxon did with the voyage, it held in secrecy. This is a company that was very good at controlling what went onto paper. They had every incentive to try and find a route through the sea ice to get that oil to market. Were they also looking at the long-term prospects of a melting Arctic?
The official reason for the voyage was to find out whether a ship that size could travel to the Alaskan oil fields. But Carroll Muffett believes that the voyage was a test run to see whether new and faster shipping routes would open up when the Arctic ice melts due to climate change.
The voyage itself was really remarkable. They brought the ship for retrofitting here to Chester, Pennsylvania.
Just here, so it crossed that bridge.
Well, 2 times, because first they cut the ship into 4 pieces and sent it to shipyards across the country so they could rebuild it and retrofit it. And they brought it back to the Sun shipyards and put it back together and then sailed it out under this bridge.
So did ExxonMobil executives know back then that climate change would cause the pack ice to melt? One of the researchers on the SS Manhattan was Edwin Clark. We want to know from him why the supertanker traveled to Alaska. For the first time, Edwin Clark talks about his work and ExxonMobil's motives.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hi.
I'm Ed Clark.
It's nice to meet you, Ed. I'm Carroll.
Nice to meet you.
I'm Johan. Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Edwin Clark joins us on a ride to the shipyard, where the SS Manhattan was retrofitted in 1969. The place closed down 20 years later.
Well, I can remember the Manhattan sitting between two gates of this nature, and welders working on each side.
And what was your first impression when you saw it?
It's big, 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 big. And I was very proud to be selected as an ice scientist on it.
The voyage was a success. The SS Manhattan made it through the Northwest Passage, proving that oil could indeed be shipped through the Arctic.
For me, one of the really interesting questions is how much of the possibility of climate change was in the atmosphere, in the lead up to the Manhattan expedition.
I didn't really hear about it until in '69 I went on to work on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And it was a year or two after that that we started putting a provision in there for an increase in soil temperatures due to global warming.
Really?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
What, 2 or 3 years after that?
That's really incredible to hear.
Well, back in '69, there were proponents and doubters that it really existed.
Yeah.
And the scientific community was divided on that subject.
But you took into account the risk and started planning for it.
Well, even the yes, we did.
We cannot prove that the SS Manhattan was sent through the Arctic because of climate change, but Edwin Clark's statements highlight an interesting fact: that climate change was an issue for ExxonMobil at the time. Clark himself has known about climate change for 47 years. He and other engineers used their knowledge as early as 1970 in the planning and construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Because of the risk of melting permafrost, they designed better ground anchors for the pipeline's pylons. Clark's colleagues were also involved in the construction of oil rigs in the Arctic. Did they, too, apply the secret knowledge about climate change? Searching for further evidence, we find an engineer who designed oil rigs for Shell in the 1960s. He doesn't want us to reveal his identity.
Hello, Robert. Do you hear me? That's a pleasure, and thank you for your time.
No problem. How can I help you?
When did it all start?
Well, Shell sent me to Alaska in '63 to build oil platforms.
Did you ever thought about climate change? Perhaps that there has been a climate change?
Climate change was not really being questioned. It was being accepted as a fact. The question was how quickly it was going to happen, because it had very important influences on the design of the oil rigs. And at that point, we asked ourselves, would the ice be stronger or weaker in the future?
Why did you change plannings of these constructions?
The ice thickness was decreasing. So the decision was made to base the design on the 1960s conditions and not on conditions in the future, as they would be less severe.
So the first platform you designed is still operating?
It is still operating in Cook Inlet.
Incredible.
It is called Platform A.
We want to verify these claims and see the rigs ourselves. From Washington, it's a 9-hour flight to Anchorage, Alaska's largest city. From there, it's a 4-hour drive across the Kenai Peninsula. Oil production started here in 1958. Our calls to the rig's operators go unanswered. So we travel to the oil platform on a fishing boat. Environmental activist Bob Shavelson joins us for the trip. For years, he's been fighting against the pollution caused by these rigs.
So on a clear day here, you would see 13,000 foot, couple large volcanoes right here.
Thank you very much for mentioning that.
Should have been here yesterday. Alaska's on the front lines of rapid climate change. We're seeing impacts here that they're not seen anywhere else in the United States. If you look in the Arctic area, we have our sea ice is diminishing. In a decade or so, there may be no more sea ice in the Arctic. That's an incredible impact. The permafrost that lies under the ground is melting, so infrastructure, roads and houses are falling in. So there's real quantifiable impact from climate change that we're seeing now. It's not something that we're talking theoretically about in the future.
We reach our destination, Platform A, designed for Shell Oil. The engineers who built it in the 1960s knew already that the pack ice would be thinner in the future and that their design could be lighter. Robert Ma is a local fisherman whose fishing grounds are located directly in the area where the oil is produced. His niece is helping him prepare his nets.
What's that spill down there?
It's hard to tell. They're not drilling right now, but there's always some pollution coming from the platform.
Yeah, and they're allowed to do that.
They're allowed to do that under a loophole in our federal law, the Clean Water Act. It's the only area in the country where that loophole exists.
That makes you angry, as I see.
Well, it doesn't make any sense, and it's all just about profit. You know, these are our public waterways. In the United States, every American, every Alaskan collectively owns these resources. So these companies are taking something from me and my children when they dump into this water body.
There are now 16 oil drilling platforms in the Cook Inlet.
This past winter, Platform A had a natural gas line leak right in here. And it went on for several months because the company chose not to shut down the leak because they wanted to continue making profits.
They didn't care about the leak?
No.
And it was bubbling gas coming up?
Yeah. It was in the newspapers. It was everywhere.
The leak was eventually repaired after 2 months. Local fishermen and the oil industry are often at loggerheads. The platforms are old. Oil or gas spills are frequent. Sometimes the anchors of the fishing boats tear open the pipelines connecting the oil rigs. Platforms that were designed in the 1960s with climate change in mind.
This Platform A, I spoke to the engineer who built that, and he said that they used findings on climate change in the early 60s to reconstruct that oil rig. They knew that there would be less ice in the future, so does this surprise you?
No, not at all. I think they've known about it for many, many decades, and they've just chosen to suppress that information. And they realized that all they had to do is say that there's some doubt about this, and there's a question about this, and they pay people to raise those questions.
Would you say oil companies are betraying the public?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think they're acting in a private interest when they should be acting in the public interest. And I think it's a crime. I think it's a theft, not only for current generations, but future generations. We're robbing from our children, and that's wrong. And we're doing it in the name of money.
According to our informer, a 1957 study of pack ice was used in the design of the oil rig. Did Shell learn about climate change from this and other studies conducted in the 1960s? Shell doesn't respond to our inquiries. But Carroll Muffett has a theory.
But what do you think about that? That's not a coincidence, no?
I think it's a really interesting connection. We know that Hal Payton was doing research on the sea ice and how it affected marine structures in the 1960s. I think there is more to explore there.
Carroll Muffett's findings and our conversations with the engineers who designed these rigs seem to suggest that oil companies were adapting to climate change while publicly denying its existence. This Alaskan oil rig was built for thinner ice sheets. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline was designed for permafrost melt. Oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico were reinforced to withstand stronger storms. During the 1990s, oil facilities in eastern Canada were designed to sit higher in anticipation of rising sea level. In 1989, the Sea Troll platform in Norway was also built 2 meters higher, and a gas pipeline between Germany and Norway was strengthened. These measures cost billions, and they are an indication that oil companies were planning ahead for a changing climate, at a time when publicly funded research was only just beginning to understand the causes and effects. But was there really a decade-long secret research program funded by the oil industry? Our investigation leads us to New Jersey. We hope to get answers from a geochemist who used to work for Exxon. We meet with him at his house.
Hello. Good to see you.
Edward Garvey.
Yes, that's me.
Yeah.
Edward Garvey worked for ExxonMobil from 1978 to 1983.
So this is your, there you have your own old Exxon belongings.
Right, this is
Should
it.
you
I
show
got
me?
my helmet, which still fits, and the coveralls.
Okay, work safely, ESSO, prevent accidents. Ah, yeah, okay.
I don't fit in them anymore.
So you did, you measured CO2 emissions with that?
Right. When I was wearing this, we were installing the equipment in the oil tanker. We made measurements of seawater, we made measurements of the air, and we did it almost continuously as the ship ran from the Gulf of Mexico to the Persian Gulf via the Horn of Africa.
The oil companies already knew that the climate was changing. Now, they wanted to better understand the mechanisms. The research took 4 years and cost around $4 million. It was so important that ExxonMobil made a film about it for its shareholders. Its main character, Ed Garvey.
All right, come on. Yes. Some tomatoes. It's just a really good climate to produce tomatoes here.
Can you pick one?
Yes.
Today, Garvey researches soil remediation and grows tomatoes in his spare time. He vividly remembers the pioneering work he did 40 years ago.
Well, we found, we observed a number of things. We observed the upwelling and the release of CO2 from the central portions of the oceans around the equatorial zones. The data, as far as it went, was again interpreted by the scientists at Columbia maybe 3 or 4 years later.
But what has been your findings until then?
Just a whole map of the ocean's CO2 levels. So using the Exxon data along with other studies, my thesis advisor, Tara Takahashi and Wally Broker, used that information and created a whole map of CO2 levels in the ocean. So that was, it was an important step in understanding the role of the ocean in governing atmospheric CO2. It was so new and challenging that it really whet my appetite for the kind of work. And the scientists I work with, they were all excited as well. It was just a tremendous amount of enthusiasm in-house, within the scientists and stuff. And it went all the way up. We presented to the corporate board, not me, but my boss presented to the corporate board at Exxon.
Why did Exxon funded programs to know the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere? Do you know?
Exxon funded those studies because they wanted to be a player at the table.
They saw that this was going to be a problem. Exxon saw that this was going to be an issue for the world.
The executives cut the project funding. Their official reason? Lack of money. At the same time, they reverted to their old tactics of sowing doubt about man-made climate change, says Carroll Muffett.
The oil industry was an early investor in the idea that climate change is actually caused by changes in the sun. That variation in the sun is a major driver of climate variation. And that's an argument that we see climate denialists using to this day. And so in that way, the oil industry's early investments really paid off over the long term.
And the strategy paid off.
We still have in government the same kind of denials that we had at Exxon a decade ago. And they could have been leaders, but instead they didn't. They chose not to. And they really were at a position in the 70s and the early 80s where they could have been in a position of leadership, where they would have, the science that they were doing would have been taken seriously and they would have been listened to. Exxon Solar was a big solar panel engineering development entity. They had Exxon Nuclear, they had, I don't remember what else they had. I think they had wind as well. But they had a lot of different, Exxon Nuclear had Exxon Coal. They were really diversifying as an energy company. And when they reversed that in the 80s. And they shrank, if you would, in terms of their global impact, in terms of what they could do, and became much more an oil company again. They got back to their basics. But I think that they squandered an opportunity. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating. I mean, we've known about this problem for a long time. And it's just, like I say, really frustrating.
We ask ExxonMobil to comment on the Robinson Report, Edward Garvey's studies, and whether or not the company altered its designs to accommodate climate change, but get no answer. Conducting their own research and then publicly questioning the results has been a successful business strategy for the oil companies. We have come to New York City to meet a communications advisor for American and European energy companies. Sebastian Schwach welcomes us on the 16th floor of an office building in downtown Manhattan.
It's always easier to sow doubt than to convince a person of the truth. PR experts call this narratives. That is, different narratives based on different perspectives, all of which have their own claim to truth. Even ExxonMobil would not say that climate change is not a problem. They know exactly what's happening.
Large companies are now more closely monitored than 50 years ago. They need to explain exactly what they are spending their money on. Today, they let others do their dirty work.
There are networks that operate in a semi-public way, making it possible to disguise who actually finances these things without violating certain laws. What you need is a few studies by some semi-scientific authority. There are a number of research institutes that provide results on demand, especially in the energy industry. You have to pay for that. It can cost between 50,000 and 100,000 euros or even more. And if you have a lot of money, you can create your own research institute. That's what's being done in the US. Then you can do research according to your needs, based on science, or more precisely, semi-science, or even pseudoscience.
Wissenschaftlich oder eigentlich semi-wissenschaftlich oder pseudowissenschaftlich vielleicht auch dann geforscht.
And we've seen the oil industry, particularly, use that strategy over and over again. They were the early masters of it, beginning with lead and then moving into air pollutants like smog and carbon dioxide. They really pioneered many of the strategies that we've seen other industries use for years, strategies that focus on uncertainty, on doubt, on denial, and in the end, on the economics, and an argument that it's too late to address the problem, and so now we need to adapt to it.
Today, climate change isn't on the agenda in American politics. Many of Trump's cabinet members are ex-oil industry managers and climate change deniers. Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, halted an investigation into ExxonMobil. Energy Secretary Rick Perry and head of the Environmental Protection Agency, Scott Pruitt, don't believe climate change exists.
Science tells us that the climate is changing, and then human activity in some manner impacts that change. The ability to measure with precision the degree and extent of that impact and what to do about it are subject to continuing debate and dialogue.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, believes that climate change is still under debate.
There is no model that has yet been developed that scientists would say is competent at predicting the future.
And President Trump is dreaming of clean coal.
Today, I'm taking bold action to follow through on that promise. My administration is putting an end to the war on coal. Going to have clean coal, really clean coal.
In June 2017, he announces to pull out of the global climate agreement.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
Climate change deniers are now setting the tone in Washington. The day after Donald Trump's election, ExxonMobil started suing Carroll Muffett. The aim is to force Muffett to disclose his contacts. His staff member, Stephen Feit, is concerned about their future research.
What was it like when you got that subpoena the day after the election?
Well, the remarkable thing is it was surprising, but not really surprising. I mean, we knew when we started this work that they would come after us, and they would come after us hard.
I remember reading the email that you sent, alerting us to the subpoena, and thinking, oh, there's nothing I can do, and just wondering, what can we do, what happens now?
The real irony of waking up on the morning after Donald Trump was elected and having a subpoena from Exxon that day, it was striking. And it really pointed to the whole new world, the dark world that we've entered in this work. I'm concerned that the instruments of power, the instruments of government, were turned into a circus in defense of a single large corporation. I'm concerned that the person who is now our Attorney General tried to stop a federal investigation into Exxon. I'm concerned that the person who's now the head of our Environmental Protection Agency tried to stop the state investigations into Exxon. We now have not only a Republican Congress, not only a Republican House aligned against us, we have a Republican White House led by a president who is an avowed climate denialist. So what's that like? It suggests we've got a long way to go.
Around 1/3 of the members of the U.S. Congress are climate change deniers.
They are laughable. It is laughable to have a member of Congress walk in to the floor of Congress on a snowy day and hold up a snowball and say, because it snowed today, climate change doesn't exist. That is ridiculous. It is laughable, and it is sad.
Decades of misinformation and cover-ups, combined with targeted lobbying, has meant that oil companies have been able to thwart any effective legislation against climate change.
What makes this the biggest scandal that I can imagine is it didn't happen only in the U.S. The reason that Smoke and Fumes points to a scandal of massive scale is because literally everyone on the planet is affected by it, and everyone in future generations for 100 years to come and potentially more is affected by it. The scale of it in economic costs, in cost to biodiversity, in cost to human lives and human rights is truly incalculable.
We are traveling to Europe, Here too, we find people who doubt that climate change is man-made. In Germany, a country at the forefront of the green energy revolution, one would think that the ideas of the deniers would make people laugh. But is that true? Stefan Rahmstorff has been researching climate change for 25 years. He and his colleagues are getting more and more attacked for their findings.
Was natürlich für uns als Wissenschaftler schon störend ist, dass man massive
Part of our reality as climate scientists is that we are being attacked with hate speech. There are even death threats against my family. A colleague in the US was sent a white powder. The whole university building needed to be evacuated. It has become a nuisance.
For him, an environmentalist Egbert Bialk, promoting wind energy is an important step in the fight against climate change. But not everybody thinks like this.
If you own a share in a wind energy cooperative, you're suddenly called a gold digger who's just in it for the money. So if you're fighting for a good cause, like the energy revolution and climate protection, you are being attacked.
Man kann beobachten, dass die meisten der Behauptungen, die hier auch
Most of the allegations made by climate change deniers here in Germany originated in the US.
gekommen sind. Trotzdem taucht seit 20 Jahren immer wieder diese falsche Behauptung auf. Und in den
A gentleman called Mr. Fahrenholt is particularly active in this field with his book, The Cold Sun. The title sounds very nice because it implies that the sun's power has decreased. Fahrenholt predicts a cooling down. That's a spectacularly wrong prediction, because we have experienced the warmest years since records began: 2014, 2015, and 2016. 3 record years in a row.
Former energy manager Fritz Fahrenholt is one of the most prominent climate change deniers in Germany.
We conclude that carbon dioxide accounts for at most half of the warming claimed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The sun's activity and oceanic currents account for the rest.
He demands to postpone the transition to renewable energies.
We still have time to restructure our energy supply. A climate catastrophe isn't going to happen.
Fahrenholt is now managing the German Wildlife Foundation. He's still against the energy revolution, but now in the name of animal welfare. Even in young and hip Berlin, companies are working hard to sow doubts about climate change. The old cover-up tactics first used in Los Angeles 70 years ago also seem to be working here. We meet with Claudia Kempfert from the German Institute of Economics. She thinks that the political realities are shifting.
We can see some unusual alliances. Conservationists are suddenly connected with politicians arguing against the energy revolution, or conservationists form alliances with climate change skeptics. They all share one goal: to talk down green energy. Officially, they're supporting renewables, but behind the scenes, different things happen.
We have found out that European companies are trying to influence U.S. politics. Employees of Bayer have donated around $18,000 over the past 6 years to Michael Conaway. The Republican doesn't believe in climate change.
We changed the phraseology because it's the climate's not warming.
And they gave $34,000 to Fred Upton, who doubts that something can be done about climate change.
There was no real science to verify that it would reduce the temperature rise that some predicted.
In total, employees of the German company Bayer donated $544,000 to climate change deniers through so-called political action committees. Employees of the chemical company BASF donated $551,000. These are roughly 30% of all donations of both companies to American politicians over the past 6 years. Both companies claim to be committed to climate protection. So why are they supporting climate change deniers? And why are they getting involved in American politics at all?
German companies can certainly benefit from political changes in the U.S. Discussions in the U.S. oppose climate protection and emission reduction, so these issues are placed on the back burner, which helps companies. The longer it takes for climate protection to be translated into policy, the more time conventional business models have to profit from the status quo.
However, Baird tells us that the donations are made for different reasons. This includes, for example, health and agricultural policy. The press office also writes, "It is unavoidable that the candidates selected include those who do not share our opinion on other issues like climate protection." BASF claims to not be responsible. It is up to individual employees who they support. The only support provided by the company is of logistical nature, for instance, email, telephone, offices, etc. So what can be done against this system of cover-ups, one-sided studies, and political lobbying? How can corporations be held accountable? A number of lawyers around the world are working on a solution. They're trying to sue energy companies and make them pay for the damage caused by their emissions. Rhoda Verheyen is one of them. She is currently suing the German energy company RWE, Europe's largest emitter of CO2.
The steam coming from these cooling towers is actually just water vapor. The actual emissions are emitted through these high chimneys. My client is a Peruvian farmer and mountain guide who lives in the village of Huaraz, at the foot of the Andes. His house is threatened by a lagoon that is in danger of overflowing because of the melting of a nearby glacier. The risk of flooding has increased considerably. The question is not if, but when.
Luciano Liua has to build a dam to protect his house. This is why he is suing the RWE group for a compensation of 20,000 euros.
How can a power plant in Germany be held responsible for melting glaciers in Peru?
The glacier in Peru is not melting because of this power plant per se. It's melting because of the cumulative emissions from power plants around the world, including those operated by RWE. They're contributing to global warming, and in turn the melting of the glaciers in the Andes.
The case against RWE is still pending, and an investigation is underway. If Verheyen and Liua win, they would make legal history. RWE lawyers are fighting back, fearing a possible flood of litigation. So, is Rhoda Verheyen's lawsuit crazy or consistent?
Can you describe some reactions?
Of course, the case has been described as crazy, unfounded, and unlawful. It's a very unusual case for German courts. I don't think that this will be the last case of its kind, even if we lose. There are many potential clients with similar complaints, including coastal protection associations, island residents, or mayors of affected areas. Perhaps this case could also be used as a legal basis for a client from the Himalayas. This case won't be the last case, because people realize the damages it will cause.
The case may sound absurd. A Peruvian farmer suing a German energy giant for climate change damages. But in the U.S. too, attorney generals are suing energy companies. The most important trial is in New York. This is not about 20,000 euros, but billions of dollars. The findings by researchers like Carroll Muffett have helped the lawyers build their case. New York's Attorney General Eric Schneiderman is currently investigating ExxonMobil and former CEO Rex Tillerson, Trump's Secretary of State.
They have told the public for years that there were no competent models. That was the specific term used by an Exxon executive not so long ago. No competent models to project climate patterns. And we know that they paid millions of dollars to support organizations that put out propaganda denying that we can predict or measure the effects of fossil fuel on our climate, or even denying that climate change was happening. The First Amendment, ladies and gentlemen, does not give you the right to commit fraud.
Peter Lehner used to work for Schneiderman's team. He was in charge of the Attorney General's Environmental Department.
What is the Schneiderman investigation about?
Schneiderman is investigating whether Exxon knew about climate change and knew the harms that it would cause to the company, Exxon, and failed to disclose those to the shareholders.
But what is the legal basis? I mean, it's about climate change, but the legal basis is totally different, no?
Well, the legal basis is actually very simple. It is shareholder fraud. If a company knows that climate change is going to affect the value of a company, in these cases oil companies or coal companies, and they're not disclosing what they know to the shareholders, that can be fraud. And that's really the question here. To what extent is Exxon saying one thing and doing something else?
It is still unclear whether New York's case against ExxonMobil will ever make it to the courtroom. Carroll Muffett also just arrived in the city. He and others are pushing hard for an indictment. Another supporter of the case is Lindsay Myman, the spokesperson for the group Exxon Knew. She recently organized a demonstration against ExxonMobil.
You got 300,000 people into the streets of D.C. for the climate march this spring, and Exxon Knew was a big part of that. How did it feel?
That was absolutely exhilarating. The campaign is strong. I think when people find out all that Exxon knew, I know I personally was completely infuriated. I was born in 1992, the same year that world leaders gathered in Rio for the first climate talks to really tackle this issue as a global community. And so the reason that we have been faced with this phony debate about climate change is because of the misinformation that Exxon spread. And so I was born from a planet different from that of my parents because of this lie. There is already a public distrust of the fossil fuel industry. We've seen an erosion of that trust, and when people find out really all that Exxon knew, there's a sense of infuriation, of rightful infuriation, and then a sense of what can I do about it.
That was the goal. That's, our goal in doing this research was for other people to take the research and do more with it. Because information, once it comes to light, breeds more information. And the more we know, the more power we have to fight back. I think what we're starting to see is that people everywhere are waking up not only to the fact that climate change is real, but now we can identify the companies and the corporate actors that are responsible, and they're starting to hold them accountable. Here in the US, in Europe, in Asia, in the Philippines, globally. And it's a really exciting time to be doing this work because they're really only at the very beginning of it. I don't care if Exxon falls. What I care about is fossil fuels. And if Exxon sticks to fossil fuels and doesn't look to the future and look to a safer planet, Exxon will fail, and I will applaud. If Exxon adapts, if Exxon says we're ready to be part of real solutions and we're ready to own what we did in the past and make up for what we did in the past, then I will cheer Exxon. Do I expect that? not on past history.
Oil companies have to justify their actions, and the findings published by activists like Carroll Muffett are making it hard for them. Peter Lehner tells us that 3 mayors from coastal cities in California have filed a lawsuit seeking compensation from Exxon, Shell, and other oil companies. They hope to force them to fund protective measures. Is this also a possible strategy for cities like New York?
So you can see the water is close and it's all around. New York City has many miles of shorefront, and as sea level rise, whether generally or in a storm, all of these areas either already have been flooded or could be flooded. And imagine trying to protect New York from these floods. It would cost billions of dollars. Maybe they would put in a seawall there or something, but it would cost billions and billions of dollars just to try to protect New York City from these new floods.
But who will pay for that?
Ultimately, it's going to be the New York City taxpayer. These cities are beginning to realize they're going to have to incur billions of dollars to protect against the damages from sea level rise. That is not just nature, that is climate change caused largely by the fossil fuel companies.
So you think they should pay it?
I think the cities that will be bringing these cases have a pretty good basis for doing that, yeah.
Lawsuits like the one in New York are only the beginning. The oil industry's responsibility for climate change is under intense scrutiny. More cases are being prepared. However, until now, none of the companies has ever been found guilty.